Okay.
All right. So basically talking about that people who have been, let us say, born and raised into a religion, such as evangelical or Catholicism in the United States, or even those who have been converted to Buddhism, um, they bring all of their magical thinking into their beliefs in Buddhism, so that those magical beliefs that are already in Buddhism are taken up as uh, actually as pattern matching. Because you see, the people who come to Buddhism from the West, they either come through one set of patterns or another. And so, if they come through the patterns of the mindset of religion, then they will see Buddhism as a religion and see all the similarities there, all the pattern matching. However, if a Westerner comes to Buddhism through a scientific mindset, a computer scientist, a mathematician, a programmer, a genome sequencer, these kind of people will use a different kind of pattern matching, partly the kind of pattern matching that you learned how to do in university that drew you away from the religion in the first place. And so
Okay.
now when these students come to Buddhism, they come to Buddhism matching uh, a set of patterns that are not magical, not superstition, but in fact quite scientific in orientation.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so it is possible for some people to compartmentalize. And what that word means is that they can believe science all weekend, all week long, but on Sunday, now they're going to believe in Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
And then on Monday, they go back and they work with science. And that they do not want to mix these two together.
Mm-hmm.
They want to keep them separated because the separation is required for one or the other of them to exist.
Mm-hmm.
But students who come to me who have a background in science, they seem to be able to accept the supramundane Dhamma much easier than those who come from religious backgrounds or superstition or whatever. And I thought that I would make that point because it's got a deeper part to it, and that is that those people who do come from a superstitious, um, let's say even primitive tribal mentality that you would find in Africa, Southeast Asia, etc., South America, more so than you would in the United States. Though, actually, even a lot of people in the United States live very, very superstitious lives. So, one of the reasons why the Buddha needs to have anapanasati taught is to help those students who are more um, superstitious and magical oriented to come out of their superstitious and magical thinking completely. Once they come out of their superstitious or magical thinking and can keep the mind focused on things that are worthwhile keeping it focused on, then the Buddha will give them the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Noble Path, that is now taught in a non magical way.
Mm-hmm.
Where beginning people throughout Southeast Asia, when they are taught Buddhism, it is almost always taught magically or from the perspective of the Buddhist religion. Part of the reason why that is done, if we can actually give it a good reason, is because children are not capable of wisdom to know what is suffering and not suffering. And so for children, we need to give them a set of rules or a set of laws or regulations. Don't pick up the kitty by the tail, and other things like that, so that they can survive to the point that their mind develops enough so that they can actually understand what really they need to understand without just simply being told no.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, if you look at it, unfortunately, throughout the world, every culture manages to keep the most of their population as children, operating under a set of rules because the people themselves are too ignorant to figure out that the rules don't matter. That what matters is how we deal with each other,
Mm-hmm.
how we deal with our own minds. So, um, looking at it from that perspective, I can see that even in the time of the Buddha, there were those who could understand the teaching of the Buddha without having to have a huge amount of meditation, and or quite a number of the people who were coming to the Buddha were already coming to the Buddha having done other religious practices that did require the mind to be um, some sort of mind control meditation of some description or another. Um, and so it's sprinkled throughout the suttas are instances where it looks like that even in the time of the Buddha, people weren't doing a whole lot of meditation. And yet, when you see Buddhism coming to the West, what you see mostly is a bunch of sitting people. I would say typically, if a group of Buddhists are going to meet, let us say on Friday evening or on the Tuesday evening or whatever like that, that they will spend about half and half the time of talking about the Dhamma, having one person giving a Dhamma talk, and that also being done in conjunction with, say, 45-minute sitting meditation.
Uh-huh.
And that most of it is done where the sitting meditation is done first and then the Dhamma talk. And the reason that it's done that way is that if the students are practicing correctly, then they will be emptying out their minds enough so that they can actually receive the Dhamma talk.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, if they come the first time and they don't know what they're doing, they're not going to get good um, instructions on how to do meditation. Therefore, they're not going to do it very well. Therefore, they're not going to have their mind ready for the talk.
Yeah.
And so there's that catch-22 with that kind of situation. But the point that I'm making is that the sitting meditation is not nearly as important for people who have already put in many, many years of work.
Mm-hmm.
That if you can program a computer or that you can sequence genomes, keep your mind focused on your work for a fairly long period of time, sometimes hours a day, then that is what is needed to make the mind fit for work. That your average child in whatever country doesn't have. There's something about scientific training that is exactly the same as the kind of training that's needed for someone to see the Buddha's teaching scientifically.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that I would put that out to you so that you could begin to understand that it is more to do with uh, how you live your life moment by moment by moment. Not so much how you live your life moment by moment while sitting on a meditation cushion. That
Mm-hmm.
in fact, sitting on the meditation cushion and isolating us from the normal world is very good, but many students have already done that by isolating themselves from the normal world so that they can learn algebra or that they can learn computer science
Mm-hmm.
or that they can do the kind of work that you're doing. And so it's that ability to focus and fix the mind that's so valuable. And so the skills that you're using with your work are exactly the skills that you'll want to put to work with your Dhamma. But by doing so and learning how to focus even better with the Dhamma, that'll also help you with your work.
Mm-hmm.
Now, one of the things that I have seen over and over and over again is the quality of coming to this present moment and being here now has to be practiced over and over and over and over again by everyone, but that practice is easier to be picked up by people who have the ability to focus their mind.
Mm-hmm.
So when a lot of people actually don't understand that that quality of being here in the present moment, to stay out of thoughts of the past. That I've talked to you, I think, about the fact that the Buddha taught that because he was a an elephant trainer in his youth, that he would mention that the elephant, even with very, very big, thick twines, can pull free. By the way, part of this is in the simile of the quail, which I think is 63 or 64, something like that, uh, where he's talking about the quail can have a very, very tiny little thread tied to his foot, and yet the quail will not fight against it. And the elephant, you can take the very, very best technology, your very best ropes, and everything like that to tether that elephant, and that elephant will continue to struggle until he gets himself free.
Okay.
When that elephant gets himself free, he always goes back to the same place, his haunts. He goes home. He goes to either this side of the river or that side of the river or whatever he needs to do to get home. But the elephant kind of forgets the fact of the guys who caught him. They go back to where they caught him because that's where they'll find him.
Mm-hmm.
That a smart elephant will not go home. He will go anywhere else.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a very important point because the human mind does exactly the same thing. And so we need to, in fact, do the same thing. That when the mind has freedom, we do not want to go back where it goes, where it can get caught up again. And so normally this would be kind of anything that happened in the past, but some things that happened in the past are more painful than others. And so the mind, because it's painful, it wants resolution. It wants to match the patterns the way that it wants to. So we keep going back to that thing to try to resolve it. If you've had an argument with someone, we may think about that argument and things to say to that person for months later.
Mm-hmm.
You probably experienced that. All right. So what the Buddha recommends that we do is to not let the mind wander back to those old favorite painful places. But what I've come to understand is that any past is like that. And so it's really a good idea to make the commitment that you're not going to be spending any time in the past. That if you're looking for something, let's say how to say it. There are sankharas, there are memories built up that will give you the ability to connect the dots or give you great insights, but only in the position of new data. That looking at old dots and trying to connect old dots together is not a necessarily good idea without new data. Well, new data again is here now data.
Mm-hmm.
So we begin to spend more and more and more of our time in the here now, and spending less and less time reminiscing about the past. That this is a major, major thing because the past and the present are really, really deeply connected.
Mm-hmm.
How are they connected? Well, if we're going back to old painful things to see patterns and we're trying to resolve those patterns will then have to be necessarily resolved in the future. So the past and the future are linked together in a painful way. And so by learning to stay out of the past and staying in the present moment is actually almost all of the process that needs to be done. The Buddha talked about it. There's a sutta called the Simpa, or the Simpa forest. And in this sutta, he and a bunch of monks were walking through a forest that it had just come to that point in time where all the leaves were falling, possibly turning a golden yellow color. And as the leaves were falling, they would cover the floor of the forest so that the leaves on the floor of the forest and the leaves still left in the tree, everything was quite beautiful. You've seen scenes like that in photographs. And the Buddha picked up a handful of those leaves and he asked the monks, which is bigger, this handful of leaves or all of the leaves in the forest? And they said, surely the handful of leaves is very small compared to the leaves of the forest. And then the Buddha says, this handful of leaves is all that I teach. This is all that's worth knowing. Even though he was saying for himself that I know so many things, there's so many things that are out in that forest that I could teach, but I don't. I only teach this handful of leaves. And so that analogy of the handful of leaves has been favored. Even I think a group in Sri Lanka has an entire series called the Bodhi leaves or the handful of leaves or something like that, which when they take one idea after another. But by doing so, and in fact, you can see that this also happened to Catholicism. The original teachings of the church that came out of 320, I believe it was, the Council of Nicaea, was just a few basic things, including the trilogy. But then you look at what happened to all the Middle Ages, all the Dark Ages, all the industry and thought that came to be known as philosophy, all came out of that as an explosion, a very slow motion explosion, but a tremendous explosion from the teachings that was just one page long. And to look how many books have been written about Christianity by now. Many of them still not, no longer in print. So there's a huge explosion. That's also happened to Buddhism with the Buddhist religion, to where what we really need to do is to focus down on just that handful of leaves, just the bare basics. And possibly the number one thing that's in there is this little sequence that you find in Sutta number 48, which talks about the first step is to get the mind cleaned out, to recognize that you can clean the mind out. And this is actually easier to do by people who have the ability to hold something in the mind so that the student can stay focused on something. And what ultimately we're going to be staying focused on is suffering and no suffering, which is the basic teachings of the Buddha, which basically boils down to suffering is past and future of the mind, and to know suffering is being here right now. And that's the really basic issue that we have to teach. If we can depart that one point to students, then depending upon the amount of dedication that the student has, this is all they need. It's just this dedication to stay here, to be here now. Now, in your work, that basically means to stay focused on the work that you're doing, as opposed to thinking about what you're going to do after you get off work.
Yeah.
And so in that regard, not only will you be better at the tasks that you've given yourself, but you'll enjoy it more because you're in the present moment with it. This is the basic teaching of the Buddha. Once we understand that that's all there is to it, we can begin to fill in some of the gaps, some of the holes, some of the sequence of events that a human will go through. But this sequence of events that the human will go through will actually be a lot easier and a lot happier to go through those things if he does this one little thing that we're talking about, which is be here now. Or as Eckhart Tolle called it, this present moment. Are you familiar with Eckhart Tolle?
Yeah, I read The Power of Now.
So you know what he's talking about now, more or less.
Yeah.
Here's something that's very interesting about him is that he had his own path, and basically what it was is that he was recognizing that he was just in pain. He was suffering. And I know exactly what he was talking about when he was like that. That's how I got into Buddhism, was because I was suffering. I was hurting. And so what he decided to do was to stop thinking about the things that caused him suffering. And that's what led him to be here now. But later, when he started to become a little bit famous and people were starting asking him questions, he didn't have the answers to any of those questions. That what he had to do instead was read up on Buddhism so that he could answer the questions that he didn't have answers to. So basically, you can see that the teaching goes in two ways. One is, can the student get enough of the teaching to actually practice correctly? And as Eckhart Tolle has proven, he didn't need a teacher for that. Or the other way of looking at it is that we need to know enough of the teaching of the Buddha to be able to teach others so that they can get it and continue to pass it on. Because the number of people like Eckhart Tolle are very, very rare. He's lucky. I could have never figured it out for myself. And in fact, perhaps this has happened to you in your own profession, but I remember it happened with me with mathematics. I remember specifically of being excited about taking a particular math course. And so I got the textbook before the class started and started reading the textbook. And before I was halfway through with that textbook, I was lost. I was lost. I was disappointed. I didn't know where I was going, but I kept plowing through. All right. Later, I did the same thing to Buddhism. The mistake that I made with that math book was not doing the exercises at the end of each chapter. You know what I'm talking about, don't you? If you don't understand what's in this chapter, it's better not to go read the next chapter. And I think that this is the primary reason why so many millions of people fail at Buddhism, is because they don't get the basics. They don't get that there is this one thing to be done. And that one thing to be done is basically a change of attitude. And that change of attitude is based upon to remember the Sati, the effort that it changes, and the understanding of what is right view. Once we understand what needs to be done, which is right view, then we need to have the effort to change the attitude. And that change of attitude is basically changing from a victim to a winner, or the change of attitude from living in the past and trying to fix the past into living in this present moment. The winner, the champion, the one who says, I'm okay, you're okay, is living in the present moment. But if you'll think about it, the only way that we can complain is by complaining about something that happened in the past. Complaining is a victim's position. Complaining about something that happened.
Okay.
Right? And so we need, any time that you find yourself complaining about anything, zip your mouth shut. And stop complaining.
Okay.
Anytime that you see yourself getting angry, shut your mouth and stop and recognize, oh, this is, complaining is wrong attitude. Complaining is wrong view. Being angry is wrong view. Let me be here now. And stop complaining, and just, by taking a deep breath, you can enjoy this very moment.
Mm-hmm.
Never mind what happened in the past.
Mm-hmm.
And you can see that inside the United States now, everyone is living in this past, future, past, future, past, future. They all hate Donald Trump for what Donald Trump has had done in the past. They're all afraid of Donald Trump for what he's going to be doing in the future. All of the others who are supporting Donald Trump are afraid of what the Democrats have done in the past and are afraid of what they're going to do in the future. The blacks are afraid of what the whites are going to do. The whites are afraid of what the blacks are going to do. And everybody is caught in past, future, past, future, past, future. And if everyone could just sit down and take a deep breath and sigh, they would realize they don't got any problems.
Mm-hmm.
They don't have any problems. There's no problems. All the problems are because of old past things that happened as a pattern that didn't fit our expectations of what the pattern should have been. In fact, humans are not, as so many of us think. We wrongly think that the human being is a truth-seeking machine, but we're not. We do not. What we are instead is a pattern-matching machine, and that we misunderstand pattern matching with truth.
Okay.
You begin to watch that. Begin to see your patterns. Start noticing that. As you investigate your mind, you'll begin to see, oh, this is just a pattern. This is just a system of way of looking at it that I have that agrees with the way that I remember doing it. In other words, you're setting patterns and recognizing that you can live more or less pattern free. You do not need to do pattern recognitions, because the pattern recognitions often are ignorantly manufactured. An example of that is racism. Look at the history of racism in the United States and you'll see that, oh, the reason why people are racist now is because they were racist before.
Mm-hmm.
But if people will look at it the way things are right now, then they'll recognize, well, a clear example of that is someone who had been taught to hate blacks, and now he's got a black friend.
Mm-hmm.
But instead of extrapolating, oh, well, blacks may be like this guy, they will actually take him aside and keep all of their old prejudices.
Yeah.
Yeah. So they're still racist, even if they've got one black friend, or two or three. Uh, um, so this is what I mean is that there is a a very, very simple thing that needs to be done, but it needs to be done over and over and over and over and over again in order to break down the old patterns of the mind, start forming new patterns. And the new pattern is a new pattern of success, the new pattern of be here now, the new pattern of being satisfied in this present moment,
Mm-hmm.
the pattern of being secure, to feel good, to feel competent. Because in the past, if we start dealing with the past, we start dealing with things that didn't go the way that we wanted them to, and to now we're victims again.
Mm-hmm.
So this is such a basic teaching, but it has to be done over and over and over again. And so this is why we call it practice. But eventually, if you keep practicing and keep practicing and keep practicing, the new habits will take over the old habits.
Mm-hmm.
One example that I have of that is that when I was in high school, getting ready to go to university, I was going to go to university with let us say, the immediate goal was a bachelor's of arts degree in music,
Mm-hmm.
as opposed to a bachelor of education or a bachelor of science degree in education. It was a bachelor of arts degree, much higher. And that one of the things that I had to do was to either take 2 years of piano class, or I could get out of taking that piano class by performing, I think, three of a list of 7 pieces that the university had. And one of them I made a flub up on because the teacher that I had didn't understand the fingering or whatever like that. And I remember the name of the piece very well. It was Waltz in C sharp minor by Chopin.
I know that.
And and my fingering was just messed up. And this guy was not going to let me pass that test. And so that was like in May, and I still had plenty of time for the summer. And so what happened was I got involved with a new teacher who had just gotten his PhD in musicology at a university that I had gone to, and this guy had actually performed. Uh, you know how things are. He performed at a music camp that I was at, and so I immediately latched onto this guy to help me get this piece done. And basically, what I had to do was to slow it down completely and make. He gave it like 6 different ways to play this piece. Every one of them was wrong, but every one of them was different than the way that I had been playing it wrong. So that when he started playing it right, I had actually unlearned all the mistakes that I had put into that piece.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, this kind of learning that we're talking about at that level was really deeply buried in the mind. When I say buried deeply, I'm talking about right down to the fingers, right down to the fingers themselves, making those mistakes. And so by retraining, that same kind of retraining times 10,000 is what we have to do with meditation to unstraighten out all the harm that's been done with all the mistakes that humanity has been making, let us say for the past at least 10, 12,000 years. Because everything that society has built up in that period of time has been based upon greed, anger, ill will, including warfare, and delusion. And so, by your work with genes that so much data is stored in genes that by the time a human being is an adult, we kind of think that all of our learning was done as we grew up, and not recognizing that, oh no, most of the programming, most of the things that we learn, we were born with. Like, for instance, how to move our hands. The information that we needed to learn to use to manipulate our hands, though the tender infant of just a few days doesn't have control over his hands. By the time someone is 3 or 4 years old, he will have control over his hands, and he does not need anyone to teach him anything.
Mm-hmm.
Even Tarzan was really excellent with using his hands. You know the story of Tarzan, I think.
Yeah.
Okay. So even being raised with wolves like Romulus and Remus were supposedly have done, they still learned how to manipulate their hands. So by knowing that all of this data that's stored in the genes also is stored in what we call instincts. Do you have a pet? Do you have an animal like a dog?
Not here, but in Houston I do.
Okay, so you know that dogs are really, really instinctual.
Uh-huh.
Almost all of the stuff that a dog learns, if a dog is 4 years old, almost all of the stuff that dog knows, he was born with it.
Mm-hmm.
Territorial instinct, knows what smells good and what smells bad,
Mm-hmm.
knows when a female is in heat or not by odor, etc. All of this stuff. But dogs do have a society, and they do learn from each other.
Mm-hmm.
But many of the things that they learn from each other is instinctual. I've got so many examples. One of the examples is that the dogs want to be around their alpha male at certain times. An
Mm-hmm.
example would be in a rainstorm. They want to know where their alpha male is. It's lightning. They'll come and be with them. They want to sleep in a community. They have a nesting instinct. You can, in fact, see all the primary instincts that the humans have. The dogs have them too. Territorial instinct, nesting instinct, procreation instinct, except that the instincts that the human has that are the same as the animals or the primates have an entire layer of society that's been put on top of it, but that society was not instinctual based upon survival issues like Darwin talks about uh, survival of the fittest.
Uh-huh.
But basically, with our society, it is based upon uh, kind of wrong-headed things. An example of that is gold. Why do humans have so much value in gold? Well, it's kind of permanent. It's easily malleable. There's not much of it. But are those reasons for it to become, let us say, the standard for the entire civilization of humans? So when we look at it like that, we recognize that, oh, well, much of what the humans have been doing for the past 10,000 years, even though we've had a lot of technology, and when I say technology, I'm basically looking at it out through the procreation instinct, the ability to manipulate our environment, the ability to use hand tools, stones, axes, etc., like that, all the way up to cell phones. We humans have been making the basic mistake that my tools, my belongings, my possessions are going to protect me or make me valuable in some way. In other words, we become, as humans, we have become materialistic. And that the basic mistake, the basic ignorance that we have made is that what I own defines me, and it both causes suffering and protects me from suffering.
Mm-hmm.
Ah, so uh, what we've done then is that we go in the direction of being indirect rather than straight or direct. Basically, what I'm getting down to is it's all about feelings. We have to learn how to manage and control our feelings, but no one in our society teaches us how to do that. Instead, we think that the outside world controls our feelings, that we don't take responsibility for ourselves. The outside world controls my feelings in the sense that if I feel bad, but if I see a car I like, if I buy that car, I'll feel good. Especially if it's sold with a woman who is in a pretty dress. This is how they sold automobiles in the 1950s.
Mm-hmm.
In the 1920s, they sold them for utility. That people wanted to buy an automobile because they wanted to get from here to there. But by the 1950s came around, it was all about sexuality and all about power and all about feeling good.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, there is actually a group of things videos. I think altogether it's about 4 hours. The name of this video sequence is called The Century of the Self, and it traces from Freudian times in the 1890s with using, I think his name was, I forget his name now. He was a nephew of Freud, Bernays.
Oh yeah, I've heard of him.
Oh yeah, and that with the work that he was doing, using Freudian psychology, you see, psychology has gone into two major directions. The direction of personal psychology is that a human being can use psychology in order to come out of his own suffering and misery. But most of psychology is for those who know it, can use it in order to manipulate others. A clear example of that is someone takes on and becomes the client of a psychotherapist and pays money for a weekly session. And that psychotherapist cannot tell the person what he sees or knows. If he tells them one of two things, he'll either like it, say thank you, and leave, or he'll say, you're wrong, psychologist. I don't want to be here anymore, and he leaves. So in order for a psychologist to keep his clients, he cannot tell them what's wrong with them.
Okay.
At best, he could just go along with them and agree with them because the psychologist is, in fact, part of the system manipulating the client to keep him as a client. Anyone who charges money for Buddhism is basically doing the same thing. The Dhamma has to be taught free of charge. It cannot be charged money for. Why? Because if I charge you money, then I am assuming the responsibility for your suffering. You're paying me for it. It's my work now. And so the client for the psychologist thinks that it's I'm paying the psychologist. It's his job to fix me, and it's my job to resist being fixed. But we don't have that relationship. The relationship that you and I have is for me to give you just enough for you to go figure it out for yourself.
Uh-huh.
Because that's the only way that you're actually going to make changes. And so going to the psychologist, very rarely does the psychologist give the client work to do. Between now and then, you go and you do this, you go and do that. No, it's all expected to be done by the psychologist.
Mm-hmm.
But the same thing happens with everything. Whether it's a medical doctor or a teacher or the salesman at the used car lot, it doesn't matter what it is. Everyone is operating selfishly. And so everything about business starts to become a bait and switch.
Mm-hmm.
They promise you one thing, and then you plop down your money, and then you don't get that, you get something else.
Mm-hmm.
Because they were promising you pleasure. They were promising you happiness if you buy their product, and you're not happy with their product. Or perhaps you thought for yourself, you lied to yourself and said, oh, I'm going to be happy if I get a PhD in microbiology or something. But I don't know of any people who have PhDs in microbiology or happy people simply because they got a PhD in microbiology.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is the problem that we think that exists. That the problem is there, and I have to do something really big to solve the big problem. But this is different than that. In fact, believing that there is a big problem that takes a big work in order to get a solution to that problem is the way that the entire society is operated. And we can see that whether we're building steamships or railroads or houses or whatever it is, it's always a really, really big project.
Mm-hmm.
But your work, the job that I give you, is a very, very small project, a very easy project. To take a deep breath and be here now.
Yeah.
That's the only thing that there is to do, but it needs to be done over and over and over again because of the old patterns that have already developed in the mind. That the mind naturally, like that elephant, wants to go home.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, it looks like I've got a call coming in, and it says, all right, hang on, somebody's calling. Is it okay if I add him to the call?
Yeah, sure.
Well, let's see what happens with that. Daniel, are you still there?
Yeah.
Okay, it says Martinez missed his call. All right, we'll go ahead and finish up with this, and then I'll call him back later.
Okay.
I think, in fact, we've pretty well covered the topic that I wanted to talk with you today on, which is that the work that needs to be done is simple work. It has basically four constituent components, and that is right mindfulness, right effort, right view, and right attitude.
Mm-hmm.
These four things need to be done every time, over and over and over again, to bring these four things into play. And what happens with that is that you become happy through right attitude that you're actually able to be here now,
Mm-hmm.
to come out of the hindrances of the mind. And so we want to practice this as often as we can throughout the day.
Mm-hmm.
Sitting meditation is really, really valuable because it allows us to be in seclusion so that we can start doing this. But the real skill is going to be done is when we can do this even though the world is trying to go and get us to do it the old way.
Mm-hmm.
And the whole world will. We'll talk about it later in the sense of sympathetic vibration. That when one person is angry, they want everybody to be angry.
Mm-hmm.
The question is, when someone is angry with you, can you be joyful?
Mm-hmm.
The answer is yes, with these four tools.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, these four tools are also the four bases of power. And what is the power? The power is to be successful, to be happy, to be secure, to be
Uh-huh.
wealthy, to be satisfied with the way things are.
Yeah.
Yeah, to come to be satisfied, to take that deep breath and say, well, at least right now, everything is fine. So far, so good.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So, do you have any questions about this that I've been talking about today? Just one little
Um,
handful of leaves.
yeah. Yeah, I think that makes sense. Could you go over the four things again? Right mindfulness, right attitude, right view, and right, what was the last one? What was the other one?
Right effort. It's not the last one. In fact, the right order would be right mindfulness first.
Uh-huh.
With right mindfulness, one needs to have right effort to change view from wrong view to right view. And then one effort is to change the attitude from wrong attitude to right attitude. And this is one's right effort. Now that's very surprising. One's right effort. That's what the Buddha says is right effort. Right effort is to gain the right view and then to gain the right attitude.
Mm-hmm.
That's the effort. That's all the effort there is, and yet that effort sometimes for some students is just monumental.
Yeah.
But that's the only thing that you have to do, and at this stage, the way to understand what is wrong view and what's right view is actually quite easy, because we can apply suffering and no suffering and get it immediately.
Uh-huh.
Continuing to argue, continuing to criticize, continuing to complain, these are all wrong views. But to
Okay.
stop, to desist, to cease doing those things and to clam up one's mouth and to take a deep breath, those are the right things to do.
Mm-hmm.
Right view, having right attitude.
Could you just clarify exactly what right view is? I'm not sure I'm very clear on it.
I have left that out intentionally because it's actually quite a long sequence, and we will start to talk about that soon.
Okay.
But the easy way for you to see it, first off, I'll give you this much. There are actually two right views. There is the wrong view that's wrong because it's wrong, but right view is twofold. One is the right view that is held as right view by society, ordinary people. All of the right views that you would have that come from society would be considered right views.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's another kind of right view that is supramundane, noble, and a factor of the path.
Mm-hmm.
Ordinary right view almost always winds up in ripening in attachment or clinging, which leads to suffering.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? Clear example of that, it is truly right view for the wealthy man in the town to contribute a great amount of money to the building of a temple.
Okay.
That's ordinary right view, and everybody agrees with it. The monks agree, and the people of the town agree, and everybody's agreeing, okay? But what makes it ordinary right view is that now he's expecting something out of it.
Okay.
All right? Supramundane right view says, oh no, you should have gotten your enjoyment while you did it. If
Yeah.
you were going to do it, and be happy doing it. Enjoy it. But you're
Yeah.
not going to get a heavenly world in the afterlife by having done so.
Uh-huh.
All right. So this is a basic introduction. And so in that regard, I would say you already know the difference between wrong view and ordinary right view. You already know that. I know you're knowing it because you're not Skyping me from prison. But there is a higher view, a supramundane right view, and that supramundane right view is free from suffering, to where you can tell that even though you do have right view, and everyone does have right view, it still is not freedom from suffering. All right. So that's the basic introduction that I'll give you. And also right view, let us say this, that ordinary right view takes a viewpoint of the viewer, which means it's a selfish position, to where supramundane right view does not take a self or an individual's position, but sees everything from a higher good, a greater good. So in that regard, we have right view actually is more altruistic. Wrong view is selfish. Ordinary right view is also selfish. Supramundane right view is altruistic. We're looking for the greater good. Greater benefit. The benefit of this moment. So for you, thinking about, let's say you're driving your car and you're thinking about gene sequencing when you're in the car driving. While you're thinking about that stuff, you're not really paying much attention to your driving. You could have an accident. However, if you're dedicated to be here now while you're driving the car, you're mindful of your breathing, you're mindful of the road, you're mindful of what's going on, you're completely alert, and you're actually quite an excellent driver. Okay? So that would be a supramundane right view. Ordinary right view, you might have had a eureka moment and said, wow, now I know how to sequence those genes, and then bang, there's your crash. Because you weren't watching where you were going. Okay, so that's an example of what I mean by what is supramundane right view always comes back to this present moment. So where ordinary right view is caught in the past and the future, just like wrong view is. Does that help answer your question? We'll certainly get into a great deal of it in detail later.
Yeah. I was just making sure that I wasn't missing something, but it seems like you just haven't filled in all the details on it yet.
Yeah, I just haven't filled in. There's that couple of leaves missing out of that handful yet. All right, well, let's finish this one, and I'll talk to the next caller.
Sounds great.
All right. Well, we'll see you.
Yeah, take care.
Okay, bye-bye.